third in our Teen Dating Violence month, Awareness and Prevention Month series of webinars, and so it's the third in that series. We're also really excited to sort of build up the topics that we're talking about, and so today we're going to be talking about trauma-informed youth engagement practices and what that might look like. So it's really, really exciting to be able to have these conversations with you today. I think it's taken us, some time before we, and I work at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and so it took us a really long time to figure out how to do engagement with youth when it comes to violence prevention, right? But then we've taken this additional step further to try to include some additional practices and some additional things that are going to make that impact that much bigger. And so it's really, really exciting that we actually have some of these pieces figured out, much more so than we've ever had in the past. So a couple of things, just logistics for the webinar. There is a PowerPoint in the materials section if you can access that. I'll be also sharing a copy of the PowerPoint when we are done. An additional piece is that we're going to be recording this webinar. It is to be a resource for future, for folks in the future that want to listen to it, that want to access this. And so please don't share anything that you are not comfortable sharing. Again, we're going to be recording it and sharing it. So just whatever you're going to share with us, be comfortable sharing that, okay? And so I also have a couple of guests here with me, and so we'll just take a second to introduce ourselves. Then I'll go over a short agenda for our call, and then we'll just jump right in. So my name's Claudia. I work at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I've been doing this work for about 6 years, and what I do is I engage youth in violence prevention. And so what does that look like exactly? Well, I didn't really know either until I started here. But really, it's about promoting those really positive things that we want to see youth. It's about promoting those positive things. What we did realize is that with the rates of violence being as high as they are, we weren't dealing with, we couldn't just do primary prevention. There's a lot of primary prevention that we do, but we also deal with a lot of folks who have experienced violence, and so, or other types of trauma. And so over time, we've tried to stretch ourselves out to include more trauma-informed strategies and practices to ensure that we can take care of our youth in the best way possible. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about, and it's really great to be at this point and to be able to share this information and to say that, a lot of our programming has tried to include some of these practices. So Jean, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jean Gerhardt Cyrus, and I am from Kiana, and I am the parent of the youth who started Optin Kiana, and one of the two main advisors or mentors or whatever you want to call us, volunteers mostly, for running the youth group, with supporting the youth and running the youth group.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Jean. And Jean will be a good example for us as to how to think about some of those practices that we can include in our work. So that's Jean, and we also have Kaya here, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaya Murray. I also work at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I'm an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer, which means I work for the network for 1 year, and I work primarily in prevention, but working with engaging men, male mentors who are in direct communication with young men and other youth, just promoting positive messages and working with men in order to help them talk to youth about some tough issues in order to prevent violence in their communities. So.
Awesome. And Kaya's gonna, one of the things that we're gonna do is just talk about the impacts of trauma and what that can look like. Kaya's also going to talk about what could happen or what you can do, just a couple of short exercises in case anybody's triggered. Of course, we'll also talk about, hey, there's some numbers and things that you can also call mental health professionals and things, but Kyle will also be talking about that. So, I'll get started here in talking about the agenda and what this webinar will look like. At the end of this webinar, you'll be able to explain what a traumatic event is and what trauma-informed care looks like. You'll also be able to describe some of those benefits of why doing trauma-informed care is so important. We're also going to discuss the differences between toxic stress and normal stress and the effect of that kind of stress on the brain. And then we're also going to talk about ways to promote resiliency through risk and protective factors that can decrease or increase the likelihood of someone actually experiencing something negative after a stressful event. We're also going to talk about some concrete ways to avoid re-traumatizing youth. And teaching youth how to do self-regulation when it comes to their emotions. And we'll talk about what that means later, but that's a way of thinking about youth care for the long term so that they walk away being able to regulate what they're going through. We're also going to look at what Kiana, as a youth group, Optin Kiana is doing to try to include some of these practices in their work. And they've kind of taken things and not adapted them, but really thought things through for what makes sense for the youth that they're working with. I think the whole idea of Optin sort of fits that model, so I'm really excited to talk to you about that. Then we'll also talk about, what can you concretely do if somebody's triggered at an event or something that you're putting on, and then to encourage continued learning, there's lots of resources that you can use. So we'll talk about what those look like as well. So, what is a traumatic event? And it is something that a child perceives as threatening to her own physical or emotional integrity, and also to anybody that is very important to him or her. And so when we look at this, we see that a traumatic event can include things that are happening to other people, witnessing things that are happening to your siblings, or maybe witnessing something that's happening to your dad or your mom. So these are things that can constitute a traumatic event. Now, trauma-informed care is an approach that is tailored to ensure that we take into account that trauma and that young people feel supported and safe when they're under our care or when they're at our programming. This approach would also help you think about those long-term skills that they may not have because of that history of trauma. And some of those skills can include emotional self-regulation, so having outbursts, things like that, and then also even just being able to have trustful relationship with your peers, and then also with trusting adults. And so this is what a trauma-informed approach would try to promote. Safety for youth, but then also long-term skills that can help youth move past some of that trauma and increase their ability to trust and relate to other people. And so I think that the piece that's also really important is that trauma-informed staff also look different than maybe your typical staff that are doing this work. And so trauma-informed staff, so folks like you, after maybe you're done with this training, you might try to find resources to actually promote resiliency where you didn't think about it before. You are also going to know, and again, this might require more training, but you might be able to recognize what trauma symptoms look like, and might be able to promote some of those factors in your community that can make them less susceptible to that negative aspect of trauma. I also think that good informed staff are going to be willing to adapt their practices, and so whatever it is that you're doing in your community has to work. And so if something is triggering to people, if something isn't working, you have to be willing to adapt the practices that you're using to match the needs of your population and maybe some of the symptoms that they're carrying related to trauma. And additionally, staff, and we'll talk about how to avoid re-traumatization, but staff are also going to take measures to be able to avoid that, right? Because sometimes in our daily lives, what we can do is we can actually re-traumatize folks. And we can we can bring them back to that time or that moment and place, and we certainly don't want to do that. And so how do we avoid those triggers? And trauma-informed staff are going to have some of those tools at their disposal, or at least they'll plan for some of those tools. And so some examples that I have seen as far as what this might look like and again, we'll talk a little bit more about what the actual impact of trauma is on the brain and on youth and what those symptoms are. But what does it look like when a staff is actually using trauma-informed care? And I'll give you some examples, but maybe I can also hear from either Annette or from Jean in the chat box. But what would be one thing that maybe you can think of that would help youth account for that trauma and make sure that they're not re-traumatized? So supportive and positive. Now, when I think of the opposite of supportive and positive, I think of shame, or I think of negativity, right? And so oftentimes when we have those kinds of experiences, when we have negative experiences, when we don't feel supported, that can be really re-triggering, right? And so being supportive and being positive are the things that are going to be helpful, and they're actually going to be promoting those supportive relationships, which are a huge protective factor when it comes to experiencing trauma in this really negative way. And Annette, that's really great, looking at things from the program participants' eyes. That's great. So sometimes what we do is we expect all of these different things. So let's somebody tell me something really bad that they experienced without really thinking, and that's the, the point of maybe the exercise or something, without really thinking like this actually might be re-triggering for the person that has to do this, or having having every person share something without really knowing the meaning of that for each individual person. And so for one person it might be a little thing to be able to share something with the group, but for another person it may not be so. But if you're not looking at it from the participant's eyes, you might have a really hard time being able to tell that. So I think that's a really important point. All of the activities that we do, all of the things that we expect of the participants, we really should try to test those out ourselves, and then also try to look at them from their perspective. So that's a great point. I think meeting youth where they are at, that's a great example of staff being able to do that work in a really positive way. We work with healthy relationships, and that's the education that we do for youth. Who knows why youth are coming in with unhealthy behaviors or attitudes when it comes to relationships? Instead of saying, what's wrong with you, or why do you believe that, we just meet them where they're at. And we model what good behaviors look like. We also model what a healthy relationship looks like, so they can keep building on that. Instead of shaming them where they're coming from, we understand that that also comes from a very real place. I also think that creating a safe space. I think that if the place is not safe, if youth are going to feel shamed, or if they feel like there's something that about them that can be wrong in that place, right? They're not going to stick around. And so, it should increasing the chances that youth will stick around in programming and be involved. But really, that safe space is key to that. Why would they want to come back if they don't feel safe there, if they don't have positive connections to their peers there, and if the boundaries aren't set for them to interact with one another? Right, exactly. So supporting youth to be able to build their skills. So this is Jean's thoughts here, but supporting youth so that instead of blaming them for not knowing, or for their coping skills, or for walking out, or for not responding, or for not looking you in the eye, or what have you, it's trying to work on that, trying to build up those skills so that so that youth can cope while they're there with you at the program, but then also in the long term, right? Because we don't just care about these youth showing up, although that's great, it increases their chances of continuing to be supported and things like that, but we also want them to be successful in the long term. And I think that's a huge piece here in looking at things from a sort of a progression point of view. I also think the other big piece is connecting youth to positive adults. So having those folks there that can provide that support and having those folks be constant, that seems to be a great way to be able to have youth feel safe and get past some of the trauma that they've experienced. And another big piece, which is huge for the long term, which is huge for the success of the youth as just a human being in our communities and in our lives, but helping youth regulate their emotions, their behaviors in a healthy way. And we'll talk about responses to trauma, but responses to trauma are very much standard. So there's nothing wrong with that person responding in that way, but we can help them and we can help promote resiliency by helping them regulate those emotions in a better and healthy way, and they can carry that with them for the long term. And there's also a lot of benefits to you as a staff, as a person in your agency. We know that we can help youth long-term and not short-term. And so for a lot of our agencies, our goal is to end domestic violence or to end these traumatic events. And so if we're helping youth with long-term skills, we're actually having that impact, and they're not going to be passing on that trauma. We also see more engagement and impact for the youth, we're actually accounting for the things that are going on in their lives, and we're not assuming things of them. And you're also going to be less likely to burn out yourself if you're actually using some of these practices. And we'll also talk about why taking care of yourself is really important in this work. And again, I also feel like you're going to be more effective in being able to reach youth because you're actually taking into account their experiences. All right, so any thoughts so far? I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if that was Jean.
Hi, it was Jean. I'll type it in.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jean. Hi there, Lucy. Thank you for joining us. So we've already started, and we've talked a little bit about the importance of trauma-informed care. We're also going to talk a little bit now about what stress looks like. What is a traumatic event? How does that impact the brain? So that's sort of where we're at. And I think Jean also has Jean, who's on the line with us, also has a comment. Okay, so exactly. So a lot of the times we actually exclude youth. And I think, you know, in my first couple of years of doing this work, I probably did that too. And so maybe what we would do is we would get, you know, some youth participants that would apply to our conference, and then we'd call the community or we'd call the school, and the school would say, hey, you know what, they've been really stressed out, they've been really angry, they're not really happy with their teacher right now, they're not doing too good, you know, we can't have them go. And I would often say, oh, I guess that makes sense for us too. But ultimately, we were actually excluding them because of those very normal behaviors that one would show if they're experiencing that trauma. And so that's exactly what Jean is also saying. Instead of excluding them because of those behaviors, that's exactly why they need to be there and they need the support. And the way that you deal with that, the way that you deal with maybe anger or aggression or any of those things, that's actually modeling for other youth what they can do and what can be done. And it's also being that supportive adult, right? So it's modeling so many different types of things that are so positive. And so that's great. I think that really that's a big flip in how we see youth behavior and how we respond to it. And so what is, how does traumatic stress affect teens and children's brains and development? And so what are the physical and emotional reactions to stress? And now we know that a lot of us, stress is a normal part of life. And there is a normal stress response that we all go through when confronted with one-time kind of stressful events or hard or challenging events. And our bodies and young people's bodies and minds react in the normal set way. That normally means that there's a release of hormones that are telling the brain that there's a perceived threat, right? So Annette, the slides are in the material section, but what I can do right now is I can have, okay. Okay, can you see my screen now? Awesome. I'm so sorry about that. I really should have been showing my screen much earlier, so I apologize for that. The PowerPoint is also in the materials section, which may not be easy to find, but that will also be a follow-up email that will provide this slide. So thank you so much, Annette, for bringing that to my attention. Perfect. So again, there's this normal reaction to stress that we will all kind of have. This stress response is really about helping us protect ourselves against threats, right? And so some of the signs for normal stress are increased heart rate, increased rapid breathing, numbness or chills, feelings of fear or terror, and there's a range of reactions that we all tend to go through, right? And so we have sort of these reactions, and I'll quickly go over them: fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so what a fight response might include verbal attacks, or really a lot of aggression, maybe even aggression towards objects, not necessarily a person. Flight responses might include running away, but it also could include refusing to talk, avoiding your friends, maybe avoiding activities that you've once enjoyed. And then another way of running away is also drinking, using drugs, right? And so removing yourself from reality. Freeze is another type of reaction, and that's really an inability to make decisions, lack of self-care, not caring for yourself or for your relationships with others. And so for normal stress, right, the normal stress response, so either a flight or a fight or a freeze response, all of these things will actually go away over time. And although this all sounds really severe, right, aggression, lethargy, all of these different things, maybe drinking or using drugs, a normal stress response should go away over time. And the reactions, they're severe, but they are not long-lasting, and it allows the brain an opportunity to move past that, right, to actually heal from that. And I've mentioned this is totally normal. This happens to all of us. And so researchers, what they've done, though, is that what they've realized is that there are some types of stress that are worse than others. And so the differences between toxic stress, which is really negative and actually has long-term implications, and tolerable stress, which just results from challenging events that we all go through, the difference is actually quite stark when it comes to long-term impact, right? And that difference often comes from the intensity and frequency of what took place. So what kind of event happened for you, right? For how long, for how much, what period of your life, And then also, what protective factors do you have that could help you be resilient, right? So sometimes these factors have nothing to do with an individual person's ability to deal with them, right? But it has to do with how long they've been exposed to it, the intensity, the stress, the frequency of all of those things. And so, so what is that opposite, and what is toxic stress? So for some children and some teens, stressful events are never, ever over. Instead, because children are exposed to traumatic events over and over, they can't shut off their stress responses. They're constantly alert. They're in crisis. And this type of excessive stress is actually called the traumatic or toxic stress that we're talking about. And we really see that those really traumatic experiences like domestic violence, teen abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, even being a witness to violence, all can play a role in really turning that stress toxic rather than just having it a normal life event. And so what makes someone resilient versus maybe not so resilient when it comes to stress? And what we know is that because no recovery was possible from that stress, and those hormones were really just going in the brain over and over without any recovery, we know that that actually fundamentally changes the brain. And so youth brains impacted by toxic stress actually develop differently than the brains of other children. This can actually delay development because those hormones are released over and over. And so to promote resilience, what we do is we promote the ability to recover quickly from challenges and difficult experiences. Now, everyone has a degree of resilience, and resilience can be learned through positive experience and through interactions with other people. And even though some people are more resilient than others, even within the same family or within siblings, anyone can, at any age, can become more resilient. And so when we actually promote protective factors that can lower that likelihood of a youth developing a problem due to negative impacts of trauma, we actually know that we've decreased that likelihood. And if we also limit those risk factors, we can actually have a big impact in the long term, and they're actually more resilient, right? And so that's how we promote resiliency. We have these programs that really are focused on really the primary thing is that importance of caring, positive, and nurturing relationships and trauma-informed practices. So when I looked at national resources and what's out there, really the biggest thing that they said was the importance of having those nurturing relationships. So being able to have that support can help you become more resilient, and those trauma-informed practices. So I've talked quite a lot, and one thing that I just really want to encourage you to do is that, you know, we're not experts here at the network in doing trauma-informed practices, but we find it very, very important to think about these things and to include some of these practices in what we do so that we can be effective. And so you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to become an expert, but I definitely think that a basic understanding of how this could look like for your programming and for your community could be really helpful in the impact that you're making, and could be really helpful for the participants that you're working with. And so so there's some great resources out there, and now I'll also talk a little bit about what trauma-informed practices could look like in a youth context. So one thing that if you can do, and this is not possible for everyone, but if you can, screen for past experiences of trauma and consult mental health professionals. So as far as being able to provide assistance right away, if you know that there's high trauma within the group that you're working with, maybe it's worth partnering with some mental health professionals to be able to provide that. Maybe you're not the right person to do that, but if you're able to screen for that, then you kind of know maybe the degree of severity that you might be dealing with when it comes to that group of folks. I also think, just listening and listening with compassion. And, we hear a lot of traumatic experiences in our work, but continuing to provide that can be really, really helpful to start the healing process, and can model that really supportive relationship for youth who really need to see that to start reorienting their view of the world. I also think that you should be very clear with the rules for confidentiality and for reporting out, for mandatory reporting out. Sometimes youth are re-traumatized when going through the court system. Sometimes youth are re-traumatized when they're seeking services because they share maybe something with somebody and they don't know that that person then has to report it, and so they're not quite ready for all those other things that come with it. And so really be clear about confidentiality, mandatory reporting. What does that look like at your organization, so that you're not taking control away from youth when it comes to their own experiences. I also think you should think about a safe place and how to provide that for youth that's free of stressors. And so if youth don't have that type of a place and they're coming into a place that's re-triggering them, that's not going to be super helpful as far as them continuing to be engaged, but then also them being able to gain those really good skills for the long term. And we will also talk a little bit more about this, but help youth actually regulate and manage their emotions in responses to trauma. It is great when youth, learn the boundaries of our group or learn what we're doing really well, and they continue to come to our programs. More importantly, they can actually carry these skills for themselves for their whole lives, and they can start that healing process, and they can actually avoid passing it on in the future. So I think for our violence prevention purposes, it's really, really important to think about the social and emotional learning for youth. I also think that you should provide self-care practices for the youth that you're working with. Actually have those conversations. What does self-care look like for students? Is it included in the programming that you're doing? And then take care of yourself, because you are a valuable member of your team. You have expertise when it comes to working with youth, and those shifts in supportive adults can be really difficult for youth. And so if we can avoid burnout on the part of staff by making sure that everyone is taking care of themselves, then we can actually be that much more productive and impactful and that much more supportive of youth. So, Jean, I'm going to skip a couple of slides here because I think I've talked enough. I'll go back and talk about some practices that you can avoid, that could help you avoid re-traumatization. I'll also talk about how you can do some of that self-regulating. But do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things that you all do to make sure that you are supportive and sort of thinking about these long-term things for youth in your groups?
Sure. I'm going to get to my notes so I don't forget anything.
No worries.
So,
thank you.
Optin actually was developed by a youth who had experienced a lot of trauma in school and also in the community and socially, and been pretty much excluded, and wanted a place that was safe for kids to go. So that's how it started. And Optin In Kiana stands for One Positive Thing in Kiana, and our motto is do at least one positive thing every day. We are an all-inclusive, community-based group created by youth, for youth, and that's really important because there are opportunities in school, but very often those are only available to youth who are either popular or voted in or selected for one reason or another, but not youth who maybe have behavioral or learning issues or are not succeeding academically or you know, have behavioral health issues. And so Optin really is geared towards anybody who wants to participate. And I always say, you know, if you show up, somebody said, how many members do you have? If you show up, you're a member. So it's kind of hard to say. But it's easier to be, it's actually easier to become a member than to unbecome a member, because we'll follow up with you and we'll look for you and we'll be calling you to come back. You know, we never kick anyone out. We've had people, we've had youth and we've had adults raise concerns about a youth maybe who was bullying or who was not being respectful or something like that. And very often it comes with the comment, you know, they shouldn't go if it's on a trip, or they shouldn't, you know, they shouldn't even be part of this. And my response is always, that's exactly why they should be a part of it. Because if we exclude them, then we remove the opportunity for them to be in a positive environment where they can be supported and where they can feel successful. And for a lot of our kids, that's the thing that they lack, you know. And it's been really interesting watching the youth over time, because they will say, remember, be positive, you know, in phrasing something. And that's how we know it's actually taking hold. And they will check themselves sometimes and rephrase things immediately, which is pretty neat. You know, we do make a point of, we always do attendance, and we always say, you know, we're welcoming to the kids, that we're glad you're there. When we have meetings, the youth are involved in developing the agendas, and we rotate positions, like the chair of the meeting or the secretaries. We usually have two. We've thrown in a financial reporter, and we rotate the positions because you don't have to be elected, and they should know that everybody can do it. And we provide that opportunity for them. One of the other things we do is we talk about positive things. You know, what's one positive thing? Who has something positive to share? You know, in one group, one day, I remember a youth who has come so far, and she said, I didn't box in this kid's name today. I said, well, that's good self-control, and what did you do instead? You know, and she said, I just made a tight fist and put my arms down. And I said, awesome, you know, that's great. You know, that's really self-control. So those kinds of things, and then we talk about what positive thing we're all going to focus on. Maybe, you know, if there was a death in the village, maybe we're going to help with fundraising or help at the cookhouse, or, you know, something like that. And the youth, you know, we do a lot of fundraising, and I think one of the big things is they really have ownership, and because they have ownership, they take ownership. You know, I talk to the youth about some other groups they're involved in, and, you know, they don't develop the agendas, they don't run the meetings, they don't, you know, they basically tell them this is what's happening, and that's not, you know, how we operate. And they really do, when we're talking about fundraising, they're like, you know, I want to do face painting, I want to do, I'll make s'mores, you know, do we have any chocolate left, you know. It's pretty neat just to sit back and listen to them from when they started and were kind of there, you know, and not really participating. Now they're, you know, okay, who's going to be the chair for the next meeting? Oh, I want to do that reporting thing where you stand up in front of the group, you know, what's that called? And you know, and this is, you know, I credit Claudia with teaching empowerment, because I think that's a lot of what it is. It's just empowering you so that they have control over this, and hopefully see that they do have control over some things, and that helps them in dealing with other situations that maybe aren't so positive, realizing that, you know, they do have skills that are important. We really try to not do any, you know, we're working on our conference now, so things happen quickly sometimes, but for the most part we try hard that we don't make any decisions without consulting at least one youth, and usually more, because otherwise it's too easy to get away from it's a youth group. And that, I think that's about it, unless there's anything you can think of, Claudia.
No, I mean, that's beautiful to just hear all the different things that you all are doing and the thoughtfulness that you're putting into just every meeting, you know, even if maybe it leaves things a little bit harder to plan maybe, but ultimately it's actually that much more beneficial for the students. And I think one thing that I maybe would like to add is that your approach and the way that you've been doing things, I mean, I've seen tremendous growth for the youth that have participated at Lead On. So I think, you know, first year you guys were there, second year, so that the project that came out of the first year was to create this group so that those changes could continue. It wasn't a one-time activity. After that, there was a conference because, you know, I remember your youth group saying, well, what about the other kids in the community? How can we get them to the table? And what does that mean for them if they don't have access to the things that we're doing? So then they did this conference that was community-wide, and now I think it's even gotten bigger. So I've really seen a lot of sort of growth for Optin, but then also for the individual youth, which I think really speaks to that ability for us to work on both the long-term pieces for youth, but then also the short-term skill building that they really need to be successful individuals. So anyway, just a great job really supporting.
I just want, you hit on something. I think that success is crucial. They have, you know, some of these kids, you know, I remember when we took some youth to the YWCA Multicultural Conference, or no, when we went to Lead On, and the school secretary called me and said, you know that 2 of those kids aren't passing classes. And I wanted to say, you know, we don't care, but, you know, I said, that's exactly why they need to go. You know, they need to be involved in something positive that they can be acknowledged for. And it seems hard often when kids are not being successful to acknowledge any success. You know, over the Christmas activities, one of the middle school kids won a party contest, and that was awesome because he really needed successes. And somebody said, and he's the worst one there, you know, and it was like, gee whiz, let him enjoy it, you know, let him. So that was pretty sad. I wasn't there to witness it, but our other advisor was, and she was telling me. But, you know, often that seems too bad, and you know, we really focus on, yeah, that you're right. They did that, and that wasn't a good choice. But, you know, every time we have a fundraiser, they're making s'mores. I mean, they're like the s'more queen, you know. So, you know, we really try to redirect it and say, yes.
And I think, you know, to add to that too, that it's pretty normal for young people to be a little bit rebellious, to reject, you know, childhood interests or different things like that, to go through that period. But I think there is a difference when it's actually impacting their life or their ability to be successful in the long term. And I think instead of really trying to tease out that difference and help that student out, we sometimes actually go out of our way to punish them. And so I think it's really great that you've actually taken a different approach and that you advocate for youth when that other perspective comes up. Because I think they have a hard time really advocating for themselves in that way. So that's great.
Well, it's familiar to not be successful, and we need to turn it around and make it so they're familiar that they are successful.
Perfect. So that's great. Is there anything else that anybody's wondering about or that you wanted to share, Jean? Otherwise, we'll kind of quickly go into a few other things, if that's okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jean, for both the work that you're doing and the way that you're doing it, and for being here to chat with us today. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
So I think one of the things that we really want to be careful of is to avoid practices that could re-traumatize youth, and re-traumatization might still happen, but how do we actually just decrease that likelihood? And like I said, anything that feels like shaming, anything that where youth have to rate themselves, or it's a contest or things like that, sometimes it can be silly and it can be fun, but sometimes it's shaming, and we're not really thinking of things from that perspective, and youth don't feel like coming back, or they feel, you know, they're accessing some of those feelings that they've already felt that are related to trauma of lack of self-esteem and some of those things. I think planning without youth collaboration is a huge one, because if we plan whatever activity, then we're basically telling that youth, you're going to be thrown into these situations, activities, interactions that you did not sign up to be part of. And so without planning with them, without collaborating with them, how can we possibly say that they want to be part of anything? I also think that sometimes when youth are getting in trouble, we might restrain or isolate them, and that could be re-traumatizing. And so how do we make sure that a youth feels supported, maybe after having some kind of stress or traumatic experience, without isolating them, without restraining them further, and therefore actually propelling that trauma to be that much greater? I also think, again, if you're asking for youth stories, if you're asking for them to talk about their lives without telling them the guidelines that you're working under, that is not fair. They should know exactly what will happen to their stories if they share those stories. Again, it could make them feel very unsafe and vulnerable, because now people have those stories and they don't know how to, they don't know what will happen to them. And this can also happen with other people in the group. So if you yourself know exactly the story is not going to go anywhere, but you haven't made those rules for the entire group, then we're still going to have some youth that are feeling unsafe and vulnerable, and they're going to be feeling like people out there talking about them, which doesn't make any kind of sense. I also think that any sudden transitions that are not explained, any changes, staff, locations, expectations, anything like that, can be really hard for youth. And so really be thoughtful about how you present transition, how you present changes, and make sure that they're part of those changes and transitions, so that they could feel empowered rather than feel like that power is taken away. And now, you know, we only have another couple of minutes or so, but ultimately you might have a youth that is re-triggered, or that has an experience like that. And so, I think if we have the right practices, we can decrease those chances, right? However, I also wanted to leave you with a couple of tools. Now, no, these aren't the best tools out there. They're not, they're not the most amazing tools. But I guess what I'm saying is there are some really great tools out there, and Kaya will discuss a couple of them for what to do when you think that somebody's triggered, or to have some preparation for when that might happen with the group that you're in. And then we'll quickly go over to another topic and talk about resources. So please go ahead and tell us about what people can do as far as triggers. Sure. Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that ends up happening, and Claudia talked about this very briefly, about the fight, flight, or freeze effect. When someone is triggered, it's kind of like a post-traumatic stress disorder flashback for some people. For some people, they experience high levels of anxiety, a rush of adrenaline, shutdown of their faculties, Some people feel as if they can't breathe, and some people are physically placed back into the moment of their trauma. So one of the things that helps with anyone who's experiencing a trigger is to ground them within their own environment. And again, this goes back to the establishing a safe space. So if you can recognize that somebody's having a triggering effect from something that's happening within the environment that that they're in, or something that somebody's been saying, or anything of that nature, it's helpful to give them these kind of grounding tools and techniques, so that maybe they can do these grounding techniques on their own. But if you can see that a person is visibly distressed, it helps to pull them away from that environment, get them to a safe space, an isolated room, preferably with no windows, so that there's not a lot of external stimuli.
But you're saying, like, have some support there, right?
With somebody, yeah, in the room with them. But just pull them out of that environment, get them to a quiet location where you can stay with them and give them the support that they need. And then these are just a couple of exercises that allows people to be in the moment and to kind of pull them out of that triggering effect. So it's called, one of them is called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. And basically, you walk the triggered person through these steps. So within the environment that they're in at the moment, you ask them to say out loud 5 things that they can see, 4 things that they can touch, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. And you know, this may require some prompting and some imagination, or it may help for, if they can't talk at the moment, it may help for you to do it for them, so that they're still experiencing and hearing the things that you're saying within that moment in time. They'll still focus on it with you. Another thing that helps is to have a grab bag on hand. A lot of times when someone's feeling a trigger experience, they need something to squeeze, whether that's a hand or whether that's a fidget toy, which that could be anything from like a balloon full of sand, or you know, a toy or Play-Doh or anything of that nature. And some things that could help as well, just bringing them back into an environment and enabling the senses, are some sort of candy like peppermint, which is kind of calming. Definitely water. Some people like to make lists in order for them to kind of bring back into the moment. And that can even help with your 5-4-3-2-1 technique. So having paper or writing or coloring utensils on hand is also a good idea, and that can also help people to express what they're feeling visually, rather than doing it within a responsive kind of way, if they don't have those words at the moment. So,
and I would say too that it's important to gauge the severity of the trigger, and that it may be important to call a mental health professional that can help those students. Now, that's not something that is a bad thing. I think that there are some people that are really well trained to be able to help in these kinds of situations. I also think that depending on the severity of things, youth might feel safe being able to take some time and do some of these techniques. But really, it's about finding tools that work, putting some tools into place, and then also knowing, hey, who can I call, what can I do if things are severe and I need to do something different, or youth are self-harming, or there's something else that's just more severe going on. So this is just a quick thing, but as far as teaching self-regulation, that can be a really great thing for students, right? And so why do we want to help them regulate their emotions? Well, that's because that's the long-term goal. We can help them actually rewire their brain through this self-regulation that they can do. And so some things that you can do, and again, there's a lot of resources on this, but helping youth actually name feelings related to their traumatic experiences. That's a good start to the healing process. Helping youth understand the types of feelings associated with trauma so they can better understand the symptoms that they're having. Sometimes they also are blaming themselves and saying, like, what is wrong with me? I can't do these things, or I am behaving like this, or what have you. But there are symptoms, and we can manage those symptoms, right? But not if we don't understand, you know, what's stemming from trauma or what can actually trigger us. I also think that you can take some time and teach calming techniques. That can be deep breathing, muscle relaxation, things like that, that can help you actually physically relax. And then additionally, you're not the only one in this youth's life. So how can we actually provide support to family and caregivers who also care for this student and who care for this youth to be able to do some of the same things, so that they're hearing and they're hearing similar messages coming from multiple sources, and they have a lot of support. So there's some really great resources, and I encourage all of you to continue your education when it comes to trauma-informed resources and also practices. And I also think that really I encourage you to adapt some of these tools and some of this knowledge to better impact your community and to the audience that you're working with. And like we said before, whether we're talking about youth or whether we're talking about adults, resiliency is always something that we can work on as a community and with whoever you're working with. So so that's really the good news, that we've really got some tools now to be able to impact that and to promote resiliency and shift long-term and short-term outcomes for the folks and youth that we're working with. So so that's the end of the webinar. I'd like to open it up for some questions in the chat box if you all are interested. If not, there'll be some resources that go out. But I really just want to say thank you again to Jean and to Kaya for being part of this. Thank you all for joining us as well. Again, you all are doing really great work, and it's so exciting. And, you know, I think that whatever it is that you can include from this to make your work better, we're happy to be able to have provided it. So. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much, and join us on the next call. We really look forward to chatting with you. Again, thank you for being here, and have a great afternoon. And again, thank you, Jean.
Thank
All right,
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jean.